Now, I just, in looking something up, I realized that I first talked to our next guest almost 5 years ago, and he has done a lot of great work since then. So it's been an interesting 5 years for everybody, including Sean McElwee. Sean is now the director of or runs Data for Progress, which is a group get involved in a lot of terrific issues. He's described as co-founder and chief meme officer. And coincidentally, our first conversation 5 years ago was about Richard Dawkins, among others, the new atheists. And Dawkins came up with the word meme, if I recall correctly. And he is also the executive, and he's been speaking of spotting things early. Sean has been involved in a lot of important issues, including abolishing ICE, including canceling student debt, and including a more sane way of manufacturing drugs pharmaceuticals as a society. And he is now the executive director of something called AVR now, and I want to talk to him about that. So kindly enough, here he is. Sean, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Sorry for the long intro. Okay, what's AVR now?
So AVR now is an organization that's dedicated to bringing automatic voter registration to New York. So New York has some of the worst voting laws in the country, despite being a solidly blue state. For a long time, despite the fact that we are overwhelmingly Democratic in terms of presidential vote, in terms of our congressional delegation, our state Senate was controlled by Republicans due to a power sharing agreement that was entered into by 8 Democrats and then one person who was elected as a Democrat who outright conferenced with the Republican Party. In the last election cycle, 6 of those members who were members of what was called the Independent Democratic Conference, or IDC, lost primaries, and Democrats also picked up about half a dozen red to blue seats, meaning they have a strong majority in the Senate. So we have a trifecta. And the demand of AVR now is that automatic voter registration and broader voting rights reform is the first priority for the Democratic Conference, and that we pass a comprehensive automatic voter registration system as soon as possible.
So I want to get to precisely how that system would look, Sean, but I want to also start with, amplifying something you said, which is, New York, a lot of people think of it as a progressive state. It has I think the laws seem to be hostile to voting registration in New York. I think the law is you plant a lilac tree and come back in 10 years. If it's blossomed, you get to vote. Otherwise, they cut off your right arm or something. No, but it's terrible, right? I mean, and we could talk about primaries too, but tell us a little bit about how bad the laws are right now.
Absolutely. So New York does not have any system of early voting, which is now very common across the nation. So the only time you can vote in New York is on election day. We do not have no fault absentee balloting. So if you want to get an absentee ballot, you have to, go to your board of elections and have a reason. In many other states, you can just request an absentee ballot without any sort of reason given. And in fact, you can become a regular absentee voter, and you'll be given an absentee ballot every election. You mentioned specifically the registration. So we have a really bad system for progressives in that we both have a lot of minor parties and also have a system that makes it incredibly difficult to change your registration. So if you were, say, registered with the Working Families Party and you want to register and you want to vote in a Democratic primary, it's an incredibly complicated system to do that, and you have to do it, and you have to change your registration hundreds of days in advance. In fact, we have the longest deadline for changing your party registration in the country. So
Go ahead. Yep. Go ahead.
So we have a lot of laws that make it incredibly difficult to vote, both in primaries and in general elections. And the barriers are enormous, and the result is some of the lowest turnout in the nation is in New York.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that now some of this, I would assume, as horrible as it is for the democratic process, and I consider it horrible, I would assume there are some politicians, and I won't name names because you may need their votes to change the system, but some politicians may like it the way it is now because it protects them from, let's say, a sudden wave of new, young, idealistic, and Democrats, for example, or just to pick a party at random. And you know, I guess what I'm trying to get at is it's not, you know, the political establishment in New York may be comfortable with having a system that's intimidating and cumbersome for voters. What do you think?
Yeah, it's certainly something that we've seen in a lot of instances of incumbent politicians being wary of this. But what we found is that the grassroots action is so strong that they have a lot more to lose from angry constituents, you know, than they should worry about. In the sense that in both Washington and New Jersey, we saw newly empowered Democratic majorities make voting reforms their top priority, and we absolutely think so that should be the priority in New York. There may be a possibility of facing a primary challenge because of automatic voter registration. I will tell you, it is a damn near certainty that they will face primary challenges if they do not pass automatic voter registration, and we will ensure that they lose their seats if they do not push forward on this.
Well, I'll make you a promise right here on the air, Sean McElwee, which is if the relevant legislator from my former home district, where I grew up in upstate New York, does not vote the right way, I'll move back and run against him. And you can hold me to that. I think it's important to for people to understand not only how bad it is, but how it should work in an enlightened democracy, right? So basically, automatic voter registration looks like what exactly?
Absolutely. So automatic voter registration takes the barrier off of registration off of the individual and puts it onto the government where it belongs. So what happens is whenever you go to a DMV or a Medicaid office, you present information that is enough for the government to determine whether or not you are eligible to vote. So the change that automatic voter registration makes is that when the government receives that information, they determine your eligibility on the back end after you've left the DMV, and then they're going to send you a letter from the Board of Education saying that you are eligible, you registered to vote. If you want to be registered with a party, or you have some reason that you do not want to be registered, send us back this, postmarked letter explaining, which party you want to be registered with or why you want to opt out. And if you do nothing, you will just be registered to vote as an unaffiliated voter. And what that does is it takes a lot of people and adds them to the rolls. What we have in the status quo is people are going to the DMVs and they're being asked, do you want to register to vote at the DMV? Most people are at the DMV to get their driver's license, either renewed or get a first-time driver's license, and they sort of push it off. They say, I'll get to that later, and they never end up getting to it. So this way, it forces the decision at a time when they're not harried at the DMV, and it also ensures that the government is testing eligibility to make sure that only folks who are eligible to vote are added to the rolls. So
let's say that I move back to New York and there's automatic voter registration. I go to the DMV, I get my driver's license, and from that point on, I'm a registered voter. I just haven't picked a party or whatever.
Absolutely. So if you're eligible to vote, you'll be a registered voter. You're going to get a postcard in the mail that's going to offer you the opportunity to register with a party. You can also register with a party online. And if you do nothing, you'll just be on the rolls and you can show up for any general election.
So what about people who don't drive? That's always been an issue, particularly in places where Republicans, by and large, have been engaged in voter suppression, trying to make it difficult for non-drivers to register. What about, in this case, how do non-drivers get on the system?
Absolutely. So the Senate version of this bill, which is the version of the bill that the AVR now supports and the Progressive Coalition on the ground supports, allows for multiple source agencies. So that means that a Medicaid office could be considered a source agency. Um, we're also having, SNAP offices considered a source agency as well. So there will be numerous government agencies where you will be able to be registered to vote.
So if I go in, for example, and apply for Medicaid benefits or what have you, I would also be automatically registered, and I get the
Absolutely.
card. Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a fantastic plan. So I can't tell you how supportive I am of it, and I'm glad to hear that other states are doing it as well. So the plan to make it happen. Let's talk about that for a second. Right now, I gather there's a bill in the Senate and in the lower chamber, and you guys like the Senate bill, and it sounds like a really good bill. What's the likelihood of passage? What's the level of voter support? How are you getting people out to call their senators and legislators and make sure that they support this?
Absolutely. So we are very confident that AVR will be passed. What I think the big question right now is how comprehensive are we talking? Are we talking about just DMVs? Are we talking about multiple source agencies? Are we talking about the sort of most aggressive back-end system? Or are we talking about, still having the decision point be at the point of service? Mm-hmm. So the Senate bill is what we're really wanting to pass. And what we're asking for folks to do is, if you live in New York, to call up your assembly member, call up your state senator and say that you're supportive of comprehensive back-end AVR with multiple source agencies. I know that's a mouthful, but we really want to convey to these politicians that the activists on the ground here really care about the policy details and want to make sure that the legislation is as comprehensive as possible. Right now, we have indivisible groups lighting up the phones of their assembly members to ask them to support this legislation. And we're thinking very soon that more groups are going to come on board in terms of making phone calls.
So right now, Sean McElwee, Executive Director of AVR Now, there are three ways this can go, right? They can pass the right bill, they can pass a watered-down bill, or they can pass no bill. No, I get how you can mobilize against the passage of no bill, but as we all know from dealing with centrists in the past, it can sometimes be hard to mobilize people to say, say no to this thing that looks okay but really isn't, as opposed to say no to this bad thing, right? So how are you guys strategizing for what seems to me like the likelihood that somebody will try to slip a nice sounding but a bill with no meat on its bones through over on the people instead of what they really need and want?
Absolutely. I think it's really important right now to give a shout out to Susan Lerner, who's at Common Cause. For the last 2 years, she's organized a coalition called the Let New York Vote Coalition that has been talking about this long in advance of us taking the state Senate and has really been working to get alignment. So I think the first thing that's important to note is we have universal alignment among progressive groups on what we want to see. That means we have immigration groups, we have labor groups, we have democracy groups. All of them are on board with the AVR bill that is currently in the state Senate. We have both Mike Gianaris, who is the deputy majority leader, and Zelnor Myrie, who chairs the election committee, both of them pushing for a back-end system with multiple source agencies. So unlike in some cases in the past, the progressive groups really have the most firepower on this issue. We have really clear alignment within the groups. We have a coalition that has ironed out all of the policy disputes in the past, and we're really coming into this with all of our ducks in a row, so to speak. So obviously, it's not over until it's over, and I wouldn't want to give anyone a false sense of hope. This is New York we're talking about, but we definitely are not going in without having done significant works to get alignment within the progressive coalition.
Well, I want to make sure that we keep the pressure on as much as we can from here. So I think what you're doing is great. I'm a big supporter of it. Utica, New York, don't make me come back there and run against your people because they didn't vote for this thing. So thanks for the great work on this, Sean McElwee. We're going to keep tracking it here, and thanks for coming on the program to talk about it.
Absolutely. Have a great one.
You too.